This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar on the forgiveness factor, forgiveness and its role in promoting positive mental health will be starting in just a moment. Our presenter today is Tim Markle, and Tim is the founder of the Forgiveness Factor. So it's my pleasure today to introduce to you Tim Markle. Tim?
Thank you so much, Bonnie. It is just fantastic to be here talking about one of my favorite things, which is forgiveness. Before we get started and before I tell you a little bit more about myself, if you could all just help me to be a little bit more present in this moment. And so I'm going to take a couple of deep breaths, and I invite you to join with me. And as I breathe out the second time, I'm just going to remind myself that what I have is here. And another deep breath. And that the time that I have is now. What we have is here and now. And I hope to be present for you today. Thank you for joining me and helping myself get a little grounded. I really do appreciate that. We're going to talk about a pretty heavy topic. Included in today's talk may be mentions of addiction, possibly talk about mental health struggles, and some of these may be triggering or difficult for people to hear. So please remember to take care of yourself, step away if you have to step away, do what you need to do to keep yourself healthy. All right, so let's tell you a little bit more about myself. I grew up in an alcoholic household. My dad was an alcoholic. My mom was very much a codependent type person. So I grew up with a feeling of neglect, with a feeling of never going to be able to have the life that I wanted, that there was always going to be something wrong. That soon turned into that there's probably something wrong with me. My older brother was my dad's from a previous marriage, and he was not very happy when I joined the family as a little kid. He was physically rough and abusive when I was a toddler and growing up, and he continued that behavior as he was 4 years older than me. He always had the upper hand. School was not easy. I had some medical difficulties that caused me to be bullied and picked on, and led to a high degree of shame. Well, eventually the shame grew into high school until I just wanted to be isolated from everybody. I started to feel depressed. My parents divorced. I blamed my dad for everything. I blamed my older brother for everything. I was full of anger, and there was no way that I was ever going to forgive my dad or my brother, even though with my faith background, I knew that was exactly what I wanted to do. But instead, I held on to that anger, and I held on to the shame. I held on to the unforgiveness. And through college, I tried to numb all of my feelings through my own overuse of alcohol. And so promptly became an alcoholic myself, and became the very thing that I grew up in high school saying I would never be, and that was an alcoholic like my dad. And so there I was at the end of college. I had let my parents down. I had let my mom down, my younger brother and sister down, because I moved away, and I really started to distance them the more that I drank, started to isolate more. I don't know if I let my dad down because he was still actively drinking at that time, but I know I felt a huge sense of letting myself down, of looking at my life and looking at the mess that I had made of it. By the grace of my higher power, I was able to get help in my 20s and began my sobriety journey for one addiction at that time. Fast forward, currently, I feel like I'm an old man. I have a 24-year-old who's on the autism spectrum. What this means, and he was not diagnosed as a child. And so in addition to being resentful against my dad and my mom and my brother and sister and myself, I got to add a bunch of other people to be mad at. Doctors who told me, don't worry about it, he'll grow out of it. Let's just wait and see. Friends who helpfully reminded me of discipline programs that I could try to help him eat his food. Various ways that I was not being a good dad, which of course reignited the shame, because the one thing I really wanted in my life was to be a good father. And so with that sense of failure, I continued on. I have a daughter too, who's 23. Been married now for over 26 years by the grace of my higher power. At one point, I started to work on a master's in Christian studies because I thought I wanted to be a pastor. So I had to figure out what to do with all this anger, with all this shame, with all this unforgiveness, because what I was doing wasn't working. I had picked up another addiction along the way that I had started to have to deal with and get in recovery for. Thank goodness I did not start drinking, but I certainly wasn't forgiving. And so my wife played an integral part in helping me realize that the more that I isolated, the less chance I had to forgive. And so she wanted to have a relationship with my family. And so we started to travel to Ohio to visit them. And I was forced to start to have a relationship with my dad. And I started to see him in a new light. It helped a lot that he sobered up. But what was very painful was he never remembered anything, basically, from growing up. Not the drunk driving, not the continuous drinking, not the going out to bars with me. None of that was part of his memory. So at the end of an extended master's program that ended up taking me about 10 years to complete, there was this opportunity to write a paper or do a project. And I chose to do a project. And what I chose to study was I looked at my faith background of forgiveness and what it said that I should do. And then I looked at the scientific evidence for forgiveness. Is forgiveness real? What does the science say about forgiveness? What can forgiveness bring to us? What can forgiveness do for our lives, for our mental health? And then on the other side, what does unforgiveness do to us? And so with that long extended introduction, I want to share with you what I've learned, because I know as parents of children with special health care needs, or as people in this world, we get hurt. We feel isolated. People try to make us feel shame. And some of this can lead to unforgiveness, which I believe can be very toxic. So the first thing I want to just bring up is the fact that present day, we are living in what I would consider to be a very unforgiving world. We have a world that respects this idea of power, and not just having power, but having power over other people. We're bent on revenge And the fact that it's no longer you have to do something physically to hurt me. All you have to do is disrespect me, and then I feel this ability, this right to lash out at you. We just saw that story live out at the awards ceremony. Is if you insult my wife, I have the right in front of millions of people to walk up on stage and slap you. That's the world we're living in. We are told to hang on to our anger, that revenge is a dish best served cold. And so it's almost like the world around us is nudging us toward unforgiveness. It's nudging us to hold on to our anger. It's holding us to not put up with any sort of disrespect, and not just not put up with it, but to lash back out at someone against it. If someone hurts you, you have the right to hurt them. So what does that result in? What happens to us when we are saturated in a world of unforgiveness, and when we start to carry this unforgiveness around in our bodies and in our minds? Well, a number of things happen. Number one, physically, I mean, if you are anything like me, as I'm going through this presentation and remembering all these things, I could feel the tenseness in my shoulders. I could feel my head wanting to start to hurt. Is that anger that I'm continually working on still wants to come present into my body? Is as we carry around unforgiveness, this can lead to stress, high blood pressure. For me, it definitely was a trigger for my addictions. It's like our body is getting always prepared to fight and defend. I've been talking to people about the fact that sometimes our traumatic experiences can manifest in unforgiveness, and that through working through forgiveness, maybe we can start to heal from some of our trauma. So how else does it trigger us? Well, mentally, we carry around it in our minds. If you are someone who is on this webinar today and you came in mind with somebody that, I hope I could get a couple of tips to learn how to forgive them, you will. We got to get through this messy stuff first, and then we're going to get to the happy stuff, the stuff that we could do, the actions that we could take in our lives. But if you're like me, there were times where I was just mentally distracted. Like I could be triggered by a song that came on the radio, and it would remind me of somebody who had hurt me. And then I would be replaying that hurt and revisiting that hurt throughout that day. And so it's really hard to concentrate on my work as I'm reliving and rethinking about this person that hurt me. And so then it also leads emotionally to depression and anger, resentment, and the sense of bitterness. And you roll that all together, what we end up with is relationships that feel broken and distance. There's a sense that we start off every relationship in a sense of distrust, that it's hard to trust people if you are someone whose trust was broken at a young age, is you just start to believe that nobody is worthy of trusting, and so we never open up. We become distant, isolative, sometimes secretive, as we have to protect ourselves. And then spiritually, people begin to feel like they're missing out on something, that they're perpetually broken, and they're feeling like there should be more to life. I'm missing out on something, and I want it. But this barrier of anger, unforgiveness, and resentment is built up, and it's keeping us from living the best life that we could. And so we build up these physical, these mental, emotional, relationship, spiritual ways of acting, of being, when we have unforgiveness inside of us, when we have this anger, this toxic anger, this bitterness going on. And so we have to deal with it some way. And so one of the main ways that we deal with it is these things called defense shields. If you remember back to Star Trek and and possibly even to Wakanda and Black Panther. Is Black Panther is also because they had those wonderful piece of clothing that turned into shields. I mean, that was just fantastic. It just all of a sudden you had the shield in front of you. In Star Trek, they appear in a new solar system, and there'd be an enemy vessel or an unknown vessel, and their defense shields would go up so they didn't get hurt. Because we don't want to be vulnerable. We want to defend ourselves. And so some of the shields that we use, and we learn these at a young age. And what I've learned about my defense mechanisms, my defense shields, is that they worked to keep me alive, but now they're working, keeping me from life. Is that I'm using them in areas that I don't need to anymore. I've grown, I'm stronger. I'm no longer 4 years old. I'm no longer 7. I'm no longer 12. I don't need to use the same defenses that I used then. And I've had to learn how to stop using these shields. So I'm just going to go through these really quick because I think you may recognize yourself in some of them. One is the shield of denial. I am not hurt. I've never been hurt. There is nobody that can hurt me, and deny that there's anything wrong. At the same time, we know inside we're falling apart. The defense shield of blame. I obviously am not at fault for anything that has ever happened to me. It is all somebody else's fault, whether it's my boss, whether it's the driver, whether it's the DJ on the radio, whether it's my dad. Somebody else caused this. There's also the defense of rationalization, of accepting this life that feels less than and saying, I guess it was just meant to be. I guess there's just something about me that caused this, and there's just nothing I can do about it. And we rationalize away the pain. Isolation and double life were two of my favorite defense shields. Just keep away from others. And then the double life was, I was able to live differently depending on the situation. So at church, I would only expose one part of myself to people, and that's who they thought I was. And then over here was a different person. And then at home, I was a different person. And it gets really hard juggling all those different lives, and you just want to be whole at some point, and you don't know how. And it leads to loneliness, disconnectedness, avoidance. It could lead to drinking, secret lives, a rage that just comes up and you're not sure why. And inside, we feel like we should know better. And so we remember this story, this word, this forgiveness, that maybe we grew up in a faith background that taught forgiveness. Or maybe you were like my family when I was 8 years old and we went sledding, well, grassing, I guess. I don't know what you would call it, but you remember in the day, had these big refrigerator boxes, and you'd sit on top of a hill on the refrigerator box and you'd slide down on the grass. And we didn't have any helmets or knee pads or elbow pads. They weren't invented yet. I don't know how we kept safe, but I lived through it mostly. So one day we're sliding down this hill, and my older brother decides he wants to run a science experiment to see what would happen if he stops the box. And so he never told me about his scientific interest. And so we're sliding down the hill. He stops the box. I roll down the hill and I break my arm. Now, this is not the way I want to spend vacation as an 8-year-old with a broken arm. Remember, back in the day, this was when they put your arm in concrete and it smelled like cat litter. That was what I had to put up with on vacation. But my parents, being the good people wanting to raise us the right way, sat down and very honestly said, John, my older brother, are you sorry for what you did? And John, being the smart kid, said, yeah, of course I'm sorry, Mom. And I don't think I think he found it, friggin' hilarious. And then they're like, okay, John said he's sorry. Do you forgive him? And I, being the proper compliant child, said, yes, I forgive him. I also later slammed his fingers in the hotel door because I was still really mad at him because he ruined my vacation. So he hadn't apologized in reality, and I hadn't forgiven him in reality. But some people get stuck on the fact that they think forgiveness is someone saying, I'm sorry, and then the other person saying, I forgive you. And this is a formula that just doesn't work. It stops us from actually engaging in forgiveness because it gives the power over to the person that hurt us. We just sit there waiting for them to acknowledge their role, to admit how they hurt us. And sometimes they don't realize it. Sometimes they don't care. But we get stuck waiting for that. And there is really no magic in just saying the words, I forgive you. I wish there were, and there are cases where that could be really important, but that's not the core of forgiveness. Forgiveness at its core is primarily not about me. Now, the exception to that, of course, is when I work on forgiving myself. And when I look back and I see where I have let myself down and when I have been my own worst enemy and hurt myself, then yeah, it's about forgiving me. But the rest of the time, it's about looking at the other person, who they are, understanding who they are, and offering them a gift that they don't deserve. Forgiveness is undeserved. But dang it all, if you've ever been forgiven for anything, you know how welcome forgiveness is and how it feels to be forgiven. Forgiveness is not about finding excuses for the other person's behavior. We're not pretending that it goes away or saying, oh yeah, well, that's just them, or, what do you expect? We are seeking to understand them, but that still doesn't excuse. If you have been hurt by somebody, you did not have a right to be hurt. You didn't ask for that. It was wrong. Hurting other people is wrong. And so what they did was wrong. And so forgiveness is not about finding excuses and saying, oh, I guess it's all right. It's not all right that you were hurt. We cannot offer forgiveness to inanimate objects. We are dealing with people and offering it to people. And I wish, and I have reread Harry Potter books to see if there's a spell, a formula, a plant that I could use to bring forgiveness about in my life, but there's not. It takes work and it takes a choice. And so let's dig in a little bit about what forgiveness is, using a definition by Dr. Robert Enright. Dr. Enright is known as one of the fathers of forgiveness therapy, one of the fathers of forgiveness research. He works out of the UW-Madison and the International Forgiveness Institute. What he says forgiveness is, he says when we forgive, we willingly and deliberately offer goodness to those who have been unfair to us. And so breaking this down, relatively, we'll dig into this a little bit more, but one, it's our choice. We willingly do it. Nobody can make us. As much as we want to make our children forgive, we can't. What we can do is we can help them see the other person has inherent worth, no matter what their actions are. We can also teach them boundaries. Boundaries and forgiveness can go together. Forgiveness is not a carte blanche to be a doormat. Forgiveness also goes along with justice. They can walk beside each other. It's not throwing away justice, but it is our choice. And it's a deliberate choice. We're not just going to wake up one day and be forgiving unless we've been doing some work on forgiveness. It's a deliberate choice. It's a conscious choice that I am going to change the way that I am reacting and the way that I am acting towards somebody that has hurt me. And the way I'm going to choose to act is with goodness and kindness and mercy, even though that person has been unfair to us. And so remember, at the core of forgiveness is this action, this time, this place where somebody did something that was unfair to us, something that hurt us. and it has affected our lives, maybe in small ways, maybe in really, really large ways. So let's talk a little bit about positive mental health. Let's talk a little bit about why forgiveness matters. Because of my own personal background, I want to let you know that I took a look at a number of different faith backgrounds, including the Hebrew scriptures, Christian scriptures, some Buddhist teachings. I ended up being invited to talk about forgiveness up north, and they neglected to tell me that the conference was being held at one of the tribal lands centers. And so all of a sudden I had this freak out like the day before. Well, am I going to be offending my Native American friends up there and people that I'm talking to by talking about forgiveness? And so I did a little bit of a background, and I just really love this quote that I found from, it's called Wellbriety, Journey of Forgiveness. And what it says is, if we do not resolve or come to terms with these hurts, they drive our actions and create a negative way of life. By harboring past hurts, we have the potential to do far more harm to ourselves than anyone can possibly do. And so I felt very confident, if that is part of the Native American spirituality, at least the part that I looked up, then yes, forgiveness is definitely part of even the Native American background. And I look at the world around me, how we have treated the indigenous people, the ongoing racism. And it brings me pause that the faith backgrounds that have been around for a long, long, long time all contain forgiveness inside them. They all contain the fact that we're not to hold grudges, that we all are human, that we make mistakes. And that gives me a little bit of hope, because it's not like the secret's been hidden. It just hasn't been brought forth. And so if we turn from the faith backgrounds and we think about, what does the science say forgiveness can do? So this is where Dr. Enright and a bunch of other scientists came in, and they started to study what happens to a person if they go through forgiveness, if they confront what happened to them, if they work through it, if they deal with it instead of trying to go around it. And so as good psychologists, as they would set up tests, and they would have one group go through forgiveness work and forgiveness therapy, and then another group wouldn't get to do that till the year after, because they wanted it offered to everybody. And they would test how anxious were the people before they started and how anxious were they after. How depressed were they? How was their heart functioning? How did they rate their relationships? How did they relate their spirituality? And so we now have data that, and you can find a lot of these studies on Dr. Enright's website on International Forgiveness Factor. He has all of his studies listed out there. But what it has shown, his and other studies, is that there is an actual reduction in psychological depression. Is that people who had a certain level of depression going in, they go through forgiveness therapy, they go through the process of forgiving, they are less depressed at the end. Now, I can think of a lot of reasons for that, but the key to me is that as someone who deals with depression, anything that I can do to reduce my depression, my depressive times, my depressive symptoms, I want to look at that. And so I see forgiveness in my own life as relieving the depression, because as I worked through forgiving myself, then it didn't make much sense, if I'm working on forgiving myself, to also berate myself and be depressed about how horrible a person I was and what a mess I had made of my life, instead of looking at everything that was beautiful around me. And so changing that point of view is forgiveness helped me to reduce my psychological depression. It can also help reduce anxiety, especially in the sense that if we go around worried all the time about how we're going to react to somebody, or somebody's going to come into our life and that it's going to ruin our day, and we plan out how horrible it's going to be if that person actually comes to work and if they're in a bad mood. And we are anxious and we have ruined the whole day before we've even had our second cup of coffee. And so learning about forgiveness and practicing forgiveness is a way to reduce that anxiety. It's a way to deal with those thoughts and those feelings that are not healthy for us, especially the unhealthy anger that we can experience. And this is the anger that just sees and goes, and this could be that generational anger at all, is the fact that nobody knows why Uncle Bob is not invited to Thanksgiving dinner, but there's no way you're inviting him to Thanksgiving dinner because nobody invites Uncle Bob to Thanksgiving dinner. Nobody can tell you why, but the whole family's mad. And no one's really sure what happened in the first place. Or maybe they know what happened in the first place, and they've just decided that Bob is irredeemable, that Bob is unfixable. And I greatly apologize if your name is Bob and you're attending this today. Nothing personal. It's also been shown to decrease post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so dealing with those flashbacks, dealing with the feelings of being back in the situation, forgiveness can help deal with post-traumatic stress symptoms. It also has been reported to increase the quality of life. One of my favorite studies is, now I guess favorite is kind of a weird word to use, but one of Dr. Enright's studies was with cardiac patients who were, in end of life care and went through forgiveness, and they were still at the end of life. They still had a heart that was going to let go of them. But the ones that went through forgiveness felt they had a better quality of life after forgiveness than they did before. They also had some interesting changes in their blood pressure and in the way their body functioned, because we hold stress in our bodies. And so I found that study to be fascinating. It can bring us an increased focus, because we're not distracted by those thoughts and negative feelings. Some of the work that they've been doing is it shows an increase in cooperation, reducing bullying. And what they do is they work with the bully and try to get to the underlying issues that the bully has and deal with their anger, so that it's not just protecting that one person who needs protection and who has a right to be angry, but it also may prevent for future bullying because it deals with that underlying issue. And it's been shown to increase self-esteem. When we forgive, we feel better about who we are. So there are a number of what I think to be some dynamic positives to forgiveness. And so now I'm convinced you, right? You're like, oh my gosh, this forgiveness thing is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So just do it. Yeah, we're going to go out there. And so then we're back to the beginning of, I was taught that I should forgive, but I don't remember anybody ever teaching me how or what the different parts of forgiveness were. And remember, as we go forward, these aren't necessarily steps. They're just sort of guideposts. They're ways that you can know that you're progressing. You're going to go back and forth between them because that's the way life goes. This life seems to me to be pretty up and down. And so the same is going to go with forgiveness. So where can we start? So as we dig into forgiveness, I again would continually point you to the work of Dr. Enright. He has some excellent books out on how to forgive. You can either go through the International Forgiveness Institute. You can find links to his stuff from forgivenessfactor.org, which is the group that I started to teach about forgiveness and mental health. So in forgiveness, what we start with is we start with the pain. Now, sometimes the pain's really obvious. If I look back at my life, I could see the effect my brother and my dad had on all my relationships, especially relationships with guys and father figures, so to speak. And it makes perfectly good sense now why I usually thrive under bosses that are female. And I usually don't do too well under bosses that are male, especially if they are not caring, compassionate type of supervisors. but we look at why we're in pain. Now, why is that important? So you might say, oh my gosh, I hate doing that. Well, imagine if you go to the doctor and you have your shoulder hurts. And he says, well, why are you here today? You say, well, my shoulder hurts. The doctor is going to say, well, do you think of anything that you could do? What happened? And maybe you'll say, yeah, I know exactly what happened. And the doctor will say, well, what happened? And your response is, well, that's not important. What's important is my shoulder hurts and I want you to fix it. Well, he kind of needs to know some of the why. Was it a car accident? Were you painting 5 rooms in your house at once in one day? Were you reaching down for something? What caused this disruption in your body? And so by looking back to why we are in pain, we begin to identify those times, those moments that affected, disrupted our lives. And we can go back and we can work through them instead of ignoring them, instead of pretending they're not there, instead of numbing them, instead of blaming other people for them. We actually begin to deal with them. One of the least fun handouts that I give to people when I'll sometimes teach a 6-week class is a who hurt me table. And we fill it out about who hurt me, how much did it hurt, how much did it affect my life. And this helps people narrow in on who maybe they want to start forgiving. Because forgiveness, again, is not something that we just offer globally, it's offered to a person. And so we start with a person. So we've identified the pain. So how then do I go about doing the forgiveness? Well, first of all, you acknowledge the pain, you acknowledge the junk that's inside, and you focus on that one person at a time. Now, along the way, you're probably going to see a lot of ways that this hurt, this pain has come in your life that you just have tried to deal with, and it's just not working. And so one of the important steps is deciding that everything that I've been trying, for me, my drinking, my isolating, my addictions, it wasn't helping me move forward. It wasn't helping me forgive. It wasn't helping me have a better relationship. It wasn't helping me like myself more. It wasn't raising my self-esteem. It wasn't doing anything to help me at all. So I have to decide to stop doing those things. I have to decide that my way isn't working. Well, and once you decide that everything you've been trying isn't working, then maybe you consider forgiveness as some way to deal with that inner emotional and mental health turmoil that may be going on. And then make a choice that I am going to try forgiveness and decide, okay, I'm going to go for this. It's going to be painful. It's going to be a journey, but I am going to learn how to forgive. One of the biggest steps after you go through and you admit that you've been hurt, which is a big step for some people, you look at how it's affected your life. You've seen that how you've been dealing with that hurt isn't working. You've chosen forgiveness. One of the first steps then is to work on rehumanizing the person that hurt you. Is one of the things that I learned that's out there is that hurt people hurt people. Is that on our best days, chances are we're not hurting a lot of people, but on our worst days, who knows? From the grocery checkout person to the person that just stole my parking place in that parking lot. There's a lot of ways that I can hold on to anger. And so one of the ways that we work on this is we rehumanize on thinking about who are they as a person, not their character, but as that actual physical person. Do they breathe the same air that I breathe? Do they get wet when it rains? Do they get hungry? Do they have, whatever, skin like I do, or skin at all? Or, it's just, what are the commonalities of humanity? And do they share those? And again, reminder, this is not to make excuses for them, but to understand. Because one of the things that I did was I turned my dad into a monster. Is I considered him to be less than human, is that something got horribly broken in him. He was no longer human. Therefore, I didn't have to interact with him, and I didn't have to have good feelings with him. I didn't have to love him. I didn't have to do any of that crap because he was a monster. But in reality, these people that have hurt us are still people. And so by reflecting on the common humanity that we share, we can start to rehumanize them. We can think about who decides who gets to be human. Is that our job? Do we get to take away the man card? Do we get to take away the woman card? Do we get to take away the binary I am who I am card? Do we get to take away the humanity card? I don't think we do, but yet that's what I did with a lot of people in my life, is I decided they were less than human. So we work on rehumanizing. Now, some of you may also fall back on a faith background that can work on rehumanizing the fact that some faith backgrounds believe that we are all made in the image of our higher power, in the image of God. Some may believe that we're all somehow connected, and so that after we die, we're going to be connected together as well. And so what does that say about the person that has hurt us and how we're going to spend eternity, possibly with them? But this whole rehumanization isn't yeah, I see that they're broken, so it's okay what they did. No, it's not okay what they did. But it is important to recognize that they are broken. I want you to take just a couple minutes with me and think about somebody that has hurt you. We're going to do a short visualization exercise. And I want you to just picture this person that has hurt you. Don't let it dwell on it. I don't want emotions tied to it at this point, although I know that can be hard. But think of this person, think of a person. And then picture what maybe they looked like when they were born, when they were a fresh new baby. It's messy. I was there for the birth of 2 of my kids, so which would be both of my kids. But picture this person as a little baby. They're there, they're helpless, they don't know what's going on. They are there needing to be loved, wanting to receive love, needing nourishment, needing comfort. At that point, they are the foundation of the person that they're going to be. They're not going to become somebody else. That is who they are. Maybe you know some of their background, and maybe they didn't get the opportunity to be raised in a household that has had plenty, or in a household that had love, or nourishment, or comfort. And this started to change who they were. And at this point, I just want you to remember that that person that hurt you began their life as that little baby, needing love, needing comfort. They weren't the monster that hurt you, which means that they didn't start off as a monster. They're not a monster today. They are a human being. And so come back, and one of the things that you can do is you can use that visualization exercise and work through the different stages of the person's life. You can start to try to understand where their life went wonky, where it went wrong. Again, not to set it aside, but to rehumanize them. We also have the opportunity to reflect on when have we been forgiven. None of us has lived a perfect life. We have all hurt other people. And so we can reflect on what has it felt like when somebody else has forgiven us. And then Dr. Enright would say, forgiveness then continues with this gift of goodness, this gift of love, of mercy, some sort of action, or maybe the action is not talking about the person anymore, but returning goodness to a person that caused us harm. And that takes time and that takes practice. And we're not talking huge things, we're just talking simple acts. One person went through the class, decided that one Christmas she was finally going to allow her ex to be part of the Christmas celebration with the rest of the family. And she's like, for years, I didn't want the man in my house. But this year I decided that I could give him that gift of a few hours. And she said it was just a fantastic time. And so if you're wondering whether all this is real, does this work? Does forgiveness really work in the real world? You can go back and look at the Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania tragedy in 2006, when Charles Robert, who was a neighbor to the Amish, went into an Amish school and killed 5 young Amish girls. And people watched as the Amish reached out, and he killed himself then, reached out to Charles and brought them into their forgiveness circle. One of the brethren living there said, I don't think there's anybody here that wants to do anything but forgive. And not only reach out to those who have suffered a loss in that way, but to reach out to the family of the man who committed these acts. And so understanding that at the basis, there is a human. And then we can look at the tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina, 2015. When a church loses its pastors, it loses a church choir member, it loses someone who's 87, it loses someone who's 26. And they respond with love and forgiveness instead of with violence. The son of one of the people killed said, I believe that once we're able to forgive, you're able to build on things and you're able to be free yourself of that constant feeling of anxiety or feeling like you need to get revenge or whatever it may be. He would go on to say that some people feel like I'm weak because I forgive, but I think it takes more strength to forgive than it does to hold on to your anger. And so some of you may be thinking, okay, I can understand forgiving others, but the person that has hurt me myself is myself. So how do I work on forgiving yourself? Well, what I've learned along the way is that it starts with looking at our self-talk. How do we talk to ourselves? How do we talk to ourselves about ourselves? How do we talk to other people about ourselves? Because what we begin to see is that we spend some of our time not honoring ourselves. We bring up our imperfections. We deny that we could be worth anything. And we start to tell ourselves this false story. And then we start to believe it. And so one of the things we do is we start to offer ourselves that same sense of inherent worth. That it's not about what I can accomplish. It's not about getting all A's. It's not about making a certain amount of money. It's not about having a certain car or a certain house. I have inherent worth no matter what I do, no matter what I have, no matter what I say. I am human and therefore I have worth. I have something to bring to this life. And nobody can take that away from me, not even myself. But there's so many times where instead of believing that I have inherent worth, I convinced myself that I was perpetually broken and that I was unfixable. And that was a lie. And so I need to begin to offer myself inherent worth, believing that I have inherent worth, offering myself a certain level of kindness. A lot of times, if we would just offer ourselves the kindness that we give to strangers, we would be more loving toward ourselves. And so we look at what do we say to ourselves? How do we treat ourselves? And what are small ways that we can then change that to become more loving, giving ourselves that sense of inherent worth? It helps you remember that you're more than your actions. Nobody gets to put on their highlight reel. And on the other side, nobody is defined by their blooper reel. Sometimes I would think that the only things that mattered in my life were the things that I had screwed up. And that's just not true. For good and bad, we are much more than our actions. Yes, it has formed us. Yes, it has informed who we are, but we're more. than those actions. We're more than those decisions. We're highly complex. We're highly messy. The other thing that I learned is that when I work on forgiving myself and I look back at some of the areas where I struggled, is that I may have the need to admit that I hurt somebody else. And that part of my healing myself can be going and telling someone else that I'm sorry for what I did. This was very true in my journey with my family and seeking forgiveness from my brother and sister and my mom for the isolation, for the disappearing act. They could have really used their brother, and I wasn't available to them. And so seeking that forgiveness and doing what I can to right the wrongs. So then what can we do today? This sounds like a process because it is. It sounds like a journey because it is. But there are some things that we can do each and every day to help us become more forgiving, to help us open up to the possibility of forgiveness. The first thing that I've learned, the first thing that I tell people is we've got to learn to shut up. We've got to learn to not pile on people at work when other people are talking about them. We have to learn that maybe we don't have to share that story about Uncle Bob. Maybe we can just be quiet. It's amazing what a difference it can be when, for me, when I don't engage in negative talk about other people, when I refuse to talk about them in a negative way. The other thing we can live is remembering and recognizing that we're leaky. We're leaky people. That's what is inside of us is what's going to come out of us. And even if we don't want to leak out on the person that we care about in our household or at work, if we have all these emotions and this anger bound up inside, it's going to leak out. And it's going to leak out in ways we don't want it to. It's just the way we're made. We're leaky people. I get to choose the positive over the negative. You can too. We can choose to look for love, mercy, and forgiveness. Talk about how what we wake up in the morning and what we look for is what we find. Is if we wake up in the morning and we hate our commute that's in front of us, we're probably going to find a lot of really bad drivers on the road. If we're looking for bad people and we're looking for bad things, we're going to find them. But if you wake up and you look for what's the beauty that I can see on the way to work? What are some that I sometimes have fun? I try to look for little acts of kindness as I'm driving along instead of looking for those drivers who, unfortunately, are those sad, sad people that their blinkers are broken. I look and honor the people whose blinkers aren't broken. I look for the people who let other people in. I look for the people that slow down when they need to. Because what we look for is what we're going to find. And I think a lot of times we've been patterned and taught to look for the negative. And we can switch that. And then we can begin to practice small acts of love, mercy, and forgiveness. So I want to leave you with the fact that I was able to forgive and reconcile to some extent with my dad, even though he never remembered and could never admit to pain. But let me tell you, as I was able to be there at his bedside and not having all of the burdens that I had carried with me, but to actually be honoring to him as he died is a gift that I will remember forever. I'm still working on my brother. I know that I have some work to do in forgiving him, even though he too has passed away. I'm still working hard. So that was a lot of pain, and I'm working through it. If you want to, feel free to contact me. My website's forgivenessfactor.org. You can email me. I love talking forgiveness. My day job is out at the Waisman Center. But please know that I very much believe in you and that with forgiveness, you can go and do amazing things because you can. You are capable of it. You have inherent worth. You have a combination of cells and of experiences and of thoughts that no one else has, which means you have something that no one else can bring. So go and do the amazing things that you have inside of you. Thank you so much for listening. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Tim. I appreciate that. One of the questions that we do have is, how can you continue to forgive someone who keeps throwing it in your face?
Yes. So this goes to the fact that just because we are forgiving does not mean we have to be doormats. So forgiveness can work with boundaries. And so if I am working on forgiving somebody, maybe I do need to take a break from them if possible. Or I need to set boundaries on the relationship that I have with them. I had a couple come in her dad was, he would get abusive after he would be drinking, but they really wanted to be part of his life. And so they go over and play cards with him Friday night, and every Friday night he would get drunk, and every Friday night he would then yell at his daughter's spouse and tell her what a mistake that he had made, and it was a horrible experience. What they ended up doing was, as they were working on forgiving him, because obviously there was a lot more going on in that life, but it was hard to forgive him when they kept being re-hurt every Friday night. And so they set up boundaries with him. And they said, Dad, we still want to see you. We're going to come over. We're going to play cards. But the moment you start to yell and get angry, we're leaving. And they said it was the hardest thing for them to actually do that, because they had spent so much time just sitting there and getting into that argument and putting up with it, and realizing that forgiveness doesn't mean we have to put up with abuse. Absolutely not. And so sometimes you may need to step away. Sometimes you may need to make boundaries. Other times they're constantly there, and it is all you can do to continue the work of rehumanizing them and trying to see them with new eyes, is the phrase that Dr. Enright uses, is seeing the person with new eyes. One of the things that helps me is going back to Horton Hears a Who, in that a person's a person no matter how small. This person who, for some reason, feels like they need to hurt me psychologically or physically, they're still a person. So how can I react to them as a person and not as a monster?
And just to follow that up, what if that person is a person of authority, like a boss, for example?
Been there. Changed jobs because of it too. Excuse me. I wish we lived in a world where you could point out somebody's faults to them and they would be thankful and they would be able to change for the better. I've had very few bosses like that. So number one, I would say, is you really do have to look at your job in the whole category of your life. And if there is a way that you can still have the life that you want with a different job, then it may be worth looking into that. The other thing that I would say is that once you know that you're dealing with somebody who they have this bent to hurt you, then you know that going in. And so reminding yourself before meetings with them that they are an angry, hurtful individual who wants to hurt people, that does not make me a bad person. That does not make me a failure just because this angry person says it. And so some of that goes back to self-talk and not getting caught up in the anger and the resentment, but listening more to what are you saying to yourself? And if there is a opportunity or a chance at the work to talk to somebody in HR, if it is a harassment type issue, then you look into the path that you have. But forgiveness isn't going to change people. It's going to change the way we respond to them.
Well, Tim, that's all I have right now. I'd like to thank you for a wonderful presentation today. I know that the people on the line with us today really learned a lot. I know that I did, so we greatly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. We're just about at the 1 o'clock hour, so we'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars for 2022, and please feel free to check out our website calendar and register for any of those upcoming trainings that may be of interest to you. Also, please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after today's live presentation. Again, thank you, Tim, and thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.